Welcome to Fresh Outlook. I'm Frank Cipolla. This week, the news was dominated by the first presidential debate. There was analysis, and in some cases, over-analysis of what it all means, with a lot of focus on Republican frontrunner businessman Donald Trump. So, who were the winners and who were the losers in this very early Republican contest? Joining me to break it all down is David Goodman. He's from Represent.us. Also, Jackie Guzda, who is professor of communications at Western Connecticut State University, and Yohuru Williams. He's the dean of College of Arts and Sciences at Fairfield University. Welcome to all three of you. So let's just get an overview right off the bat. How did you think it went, this first Republican debate, a year and a half out? Yohuru.
Great entertainment value for most of us, but I think just an opportunity for people really to get acquainted with many of these candidates. Most of them don't have national recognition, with the exception of Donald Trump. So for Ohio Governor Kasich, for example, this was a great opportunity for the American people to get acquainted, and a good introduction to some of the basic issues that are going to really frame this presidential campaign going forward.
We're going to talk about the issues in just a bit in the second segment, but just an overall view of it. How do you think it was?
Well, you know, Frank, as you know, I'm a bit of a contrarian when it comes to some of these things. And so I think what we saw the other night was really the first demonstration of what I call the Coke Party. I mean, the Republican Party that we knew when we were young, the party of the 20th century, really doesn't exist anymore. What we have now is a party that is run by less than 400 families. They've contributed nearly $400 million so far in this cycle. Their tools are super PACs and the so-called social welfare 501c4 organizations, dark money organizations, which allow a lot of corporations to filter money in. So essentially what I think we saw was a follow-up on the audition that the Koch network had the previous week in California, when they had Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, and Scott Walker. I think Carly Fiorina was also part of that entourage. But this is a totally new phenomenon. You can't look at this as we have looked upon the Republican Party of years past. That's my view of it.
And just to clear this up for folks who might be confused, we're talking about the Koch brothers, not Coca-Cola, obviously.
Charles and David Koch, but it's a
wealthy donors.
It's a much bigger network than that. It includes Sheldon Adelson. Sure. It includes a lot of names that are not household names. A lot of big oil money, people who've made money in fracking, energy, and so forth. It's a billionaires club, and they're determining the agenda.
Let's talk about the first debate. That's why we have 17 candidates on the Republican side, getting to what you were talking about a moment ago. There's a lot of money out there, and now they can donate almost at will. And 7 candidates in the second tier, plus 5 on the Democratic side. But let's take the first top 10. How do you make a choice out of all these guys and another 7 who were on earlier?
You Jackie? Don't. There were too many people. And what happened the other night was that people just got, as you said, Yohuru, introduced to these people they had never seen before. And frankly, afterwards, I was trying to figure out what the issues were, because they all blurred into each other. It was the Donald Trump show. Donald was entertaining. And frankly, I saw this debate in a bar in my neighborhood, which is a very eclectic neighborhood, lots of different people. And we had a drinking game, and we said that every time the Republicans invoked 9/11 or President Reagan, a liberal had to take a drink. So the next day, of course, I had a hangover. But the point was that everybody in that bar was there for Trump. And they were there for Trump because, and I truly see this, is that Trump has tapped into the frustrations of everyone.
And we're going to touch on that in just a moment. We're going to run some video from Donald Trump from that night. But you know, you make a very good point. Years ago, when I was selling advertising on television, I kept it down to 3 choices for the client. When there was 17, or even if you go to a restaurant and there's 25 choices of entrees, it's confusing and you're really sort of perplexing. When it was down to 2 or 3 choices, you really were it was easier to pick out the one you wanted. And now we have all these choices. We're going to take a look at a soundbite from Donald Trump, and I described this as Donald Trump just being Donald Trump. Take a look.
We have a president who doesn't have a clue. I would say he's incompetent, but I don't want to do that because that's not nice. I have never gone bankrupt, by the way. I have never. But out of hundreds of deals,
but sir,
excuse me,
that's your line, but your companies have gone bankrupt.
Out of hundreds and hundreds of deals, 4 times I've taken advantage of the laws, and frankly, so has everybody else in my position.
When did you actually become a Republican?
Now, this is a prime example of Trump being Trump, and for some reason he can continue to say these things, including what he said today about Megyn Kelly and was disinvited to an event in Atlanta, and do it with impunity. And in fact, his ratings do not go down. Why is this happening?
Not necessarily with impunity, and I think the interesting thing about Trump is this is not the first time we've seen this phenomenon. We saw it 7 years ago with Sarah Palin. I guess the best example would be Ross Perot in 1992, where Time magazine is talking about waiting for Perot, a play on Waiting for Godot. He has a 39% lead in the polls going into June. Gallup polls are saying this guy is a phenomena. Donald Trump's benefiting from that. The danger of that, and you spoke to this, is that doesn't necessarily translate into electability. And I think the powers that be within the Republican Party are looking unfavorably on him because they recognize he can't be elected. Well, they're looking for a more stable candidate.
Well, David, and they're also hoping that he will peak and fade away, perhaps worse, become the Ross Perot of 2016. I've mentioned that in other...
Well, he said he's not going to fade away. Even if he loses the Republican nomination, he hinted that he'll run as a third-party candidate.
I think it's quite
and he
possible.
has the money to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
And
I've heard people make comparisons to Herman Cain and Michelle Bachmann. I think that's all wrong when it comes to Donald Trump. I think he's in it for the long term. He's a businessman. The only time he'll pull the plug is when the financial aspect of it from his personal fortune, because this is a self-financed campaign for him.
And the money is bottomless, apparently.
When that becomes too burdensome. Well, he claims he has $10 billion, but other sources say it's much less. Yep. But, you know, what's a couple of billion either way? The guy can afford to do this. When he launched his campaign, he said he was prepared to spend $100 million. That's a lot of money.
Yes.
So he's going to be in it for the long term.
And Jackie, the Democrats must be loving this, because if he runs as a third-party candidate...
He hands it over to Hillary if Hillary becomes the nominee.
And he doesn't seem to have a problem with that.
No, he doesn't. My theory, and Dr. Bart should be here, is that he's just following his narcissistic tendencies. This is the Big Apple. What could be bigger than this prize?
So what about Jeb Bush? I sense that he sort of did himself no harm, correct? Or...
I think he did himself harm only in the fact that he can't electrify the base. I think the problem with Jeb Bush is that he has the pedigree. He's done a phenomenal job in Florida. It would be hard to argue with the success he's enjoyed in that state, but there's a long shadow that goes with the legacy of the Bushes and the White House. And he was nondescript. Nothing memorable about his performance this week.
Jackie?
Absolutely. Absolutely nothing there. He's mush. He's oatmeal. He's not electable.
But what do you really think, Jackie?
Well, let me say that I think if Donald Trump ceases to be the factor that he is, if the Republican establishment is going to try to convince the American population, voting public, that the problem has disappeared, that's not happening. Because what's happened to what I call the Koch party is that the shift in the party has moved so dramatically to the right that even Jeb Bush is talking about things that are extreme. So when you say that it's all mush and they're not distinguished, you're absolutely right, because they're all reading from the same playbook.
We're going to look at Carly Fiorina, who was in the earlier debate, and everybody's been buzzing about her performance there. Sadly, it was not seen by a whole bunch of people, but she apparently did herself well in the first debate. Let's take a look at Carly Fiorina, who is one of the candidates. Well, actually, there she is.
Begin by reminding people that at this point in previous presidential elections, Jimmy Carter couldn't win, Ronald Reagan couldn't win, Bill Clinton couldn't win, and neither could have Barack Obama.
So are we talking at the possibility, if she catches on, of a woman versus woman presidential general election come to 2016?
I'll go out on a limb on this one. I think she's positioning herself for the vice presidential nomination. I don't think she has the support for a presidential run, but she probably could be seen as a vice presidential candidate.
Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, was third in the polling. He was right there in the center of the stage. How was his performance? What do you think of how he did?
He certainly didn't lose the debate, and that was important for Scott Walker. I'm not a fan, have not been terribly enthusiastic about his position with regard to unions, but if I'm looking at him purely as a candidate and how he presented himself, he came across as someone who could handle difficult questions. There was a poise there. Notably, he did not get into any exchanges with the other candidates, had a very tough answer on abortion, which I think will come back to haunt him, but otherwise, he didn't lose the debate.
What about the social media? We should have spin rooms after debates where there were political political pundits there to be interviewed by the press, and now it seems to all have gone online. And I saw a whole bunch of stuff on Facebook. What's social media's play in all of this?
This is what's happening now. I mean, more people are watching these debates and everything else through social media. You know, I don't even have a television anymore. I cut the cable, and I'm somebody who should have it. But everybody's watching. You can watch TV on, you know, I watched it on Facebook, part of it. You know, you go back, you look at it on YouTube. You can interact with social media, which I think is the great thing. And they actually had questions from regular citizens from Facebook on this debate.
It was an interesting debate. Marco Rubio, who at one time was the darling of the party, seemed to be a bit milquetoast as well, I thought. Your thoughts?
Not ready for prime time.
Not ready for prime time. Why not?
He's just not ready. He doesn't have enough experience in this kind of a fight, you know?
So you sense that he's in the deep end of the pool and may not be able to swim?
Yeah. And, you know, in time, perhaps. But he's got to learn the waters first.
David, is he running for the next time, or maybe the time after that?
Well, certainly he has a political future. But as I say, it's much too early in the election cycle. I mean, here it is August 2015. We're looking at a long campaign season, which has also become part and parcel of our political life. This is going to go on for months. So I think there's going to be some movement up and down. The question is anyone from the kids' table going to be able to move into the adult section for the next debate in September? I think Fiorina has a chance of doing that, but she has to knock somebody off in order. If they stay with the same format, which I believe CNN has indicated they will, of the top 10, then somebody has to fall off, and I'm not entirely sure who that would be.
Yohuru Ted Cruz, who was was the first Republican to announce his candidacy for president. How do you think he did in the debate?
Again, not memorable. And I think, just to go back to the previous question and kind of tie that in, the Republican Party has a diversity issue. And one of the reasons that Carly Fiorina is so exceptional is in a lot of ways she's answering that question in a way that is different from what we saw with Sarah Palin 7 years ago. Here's someone who's super competent, who has the skills, who could be a successful vice president, although she's been very clear she's running for the presidency. But look at that pool of candidates. Ben Carson, Marco Rubio. I think that'll keep Rubio in the race a lot longer. And it also poses a challenge for the party as a whole to project a more diverse and multicultural persona.
Well, you make an interesting point. I've never known a presidential candidate who is out of the race not accept the vice presidency. I know a lot of them say, I'm in it for the presidency, but when that phone call comes, you take it. Because that puts you next in line and also sets you up before 8 years later.
We're seeing it happen with Joe Biden right now. Famously, the quip was the vice presidency is not worth a bucket of warm spit in terms of a job, but in terms of positioning for the next time, absolutely the best place to be.
Let's talk about John Kasich, who I thought did fairly well. He had the home field advantage. It was in Ohio, and that is his home state. But still, he seemed very competent, and at times almost drew Donald Trump in and said, hey, I understand why he's the front runner. This is why. Do you think he did well? Let's take it with you.
I think Kasich is positioning himself as one of the candidates who will step forward if Jeb Bush stumbles. I mean, there's several categories that we're looking for here in terms of this election. There is the stumble factor. I think Chris Christie is also hoping to move into that role. There is the what I call the Barack Obama factor, which has, you know, these young guys like Rand Paul, Marco Rubio, and Ted Cruz. These are guys in their 40s who look at Obama's, what he did 8 years ago, and say, listen, if he can do this, then I can do it. And then you have the experience factor, like a Lindsey Graham, who didn't make it to the first round, but he wants to be in it. So I think there are several factors operating here. But to come back to your bigger point, Frank, the issue, of course, is going to be the money factor. As long as these guys continue to have their billionaire supporting them, and Rubio has Norman Brayman, the Miami billionaire, Kasich has support, there's this Koch network that I referred to earlier. As long as that's the oxygen that keeps these guys alive.
If that's the theory, then they could stay in for as long as they want.
That's exactly what's going to happen.
They could, but don't you think there's a backlash from the regular citizenship against that? That they know that this is going on, that those people are pulling the strings of the politicians. I think that's part of the reason why they support Trump.
All right, we have a minute and a half or so. We didn't touch on Senator Rand Paul, Chris Christie. We know they got at it, but just their performances individually. Rand Paul.
Humorous. Again, not a huge fan, but I thought a good performance. His exchange with Christie was telling. It kind of gives us a sense about how both of them are positioning themselves within the party.
Rand Paul, Chris Christie.
Well, I think Christie presented himself as a prosecutor, which is his background. I don't know that that resonated well with the viewers for the evening. Rand Paul scored some big points when he talked about the constitutional issues and the Fourth Amendment. That matters to a lot of people in the Republican base.
All right, let me stop you there. Dr. Ben Carson, who jokingly said, I'm glad you finally got back to me. I didn't think I'd be able to speak again. How do you think he did, Jackie?
Who knows? I mean, he was asked a blunt question about his foreign policy experience, and he danced around it and started waving the flag, and I had no idea what he was talking about. It looked great, though.
It's almost like a college playoff, you know, March Madness. We should have a grid and see who finally ends up at the end of the election process. We thank you very much. We're going to take a break. We'll look at the personalities involved in this first presidential debate we have, and when we come back, we will delve deeper into the issues when Fresh Outlook continues.